Hi there, and welcome to this webinar for Tutor with me, Arthur, all about performance and learning. That's what we're going to be focusing on today, the idea of performance and learning. Just very quickly before we start, just in case there's anyone who doesn't know me for this webinar, my name is Arthur Moore. I am a full-time online maths tutor. Before then, I was a secondary maths teacher, having taught in schools across the UK and internationally. I've taught in a range of schools from boarding to international to state to private to small independent to large all through schools. I am also the lead of Navigator Tutor, which is my tutor training platform, as well as More Edu, which is the name under which I tutor. In 2024, I was nominated as Professional Tutor of the Year, and I won that via the Association of the Tutors Association. And Navigator Tutor, my platform, has been shortlisted for several years for several awards, including 2025, where it was nominated for 2 awards, including Educational Resource for Tutors. Now today, what we're going to be focused on. The aims for our session are to understand the differences between performance and learning, and to have some practical ideas for what this means for our sessions. Now, before we get into that today, thank you to everyone who has joined live. You can use the chat function or the Q&A function to send me questions or engage with the content we are delivering today. Or if you're watching live, it's really useful to kind of pause and write down your question, write down your notes, write down your feedback, and we can go through those at the end. You can get in contact with me if I haven't answered any of the questions, but still write down your questions as we go. It's a really good way to cognitively engage with the content. Now, one thing I've definitely said at points in my teaching and tutoring career is, why can't they do this? I taught this to them last week. Why can't they remember how to do this? I'm sure that all our tutors at some point have maybe thought this or kind of had that feeling. And the key is they forget because we forget, because everyone forgets. Forgetting is a completely normal human process. So we shouldn't be annoyed when a student is struggling to remember something that we've covered. What we need to do is go back and think about how we delivered that content originally in order to stop that forgetting process happening, and also what we can do going forward to help them remember for longer. So I'm just going to do a quick reminder from a previous webinar. We looked at this diagram here, which is the Ollie-Cav version of how learning works from environment. So we have got the human here, we can think about this as the student in this scenario, who is paying attention to their environment. Now, the environment, there are hundreds of millions of bits of information that we are processing every moment. I just want you to take a moment to just look where you are when you're watching this, and just take a moment to look around and try and think about all the things you are processing in the moment. So you've got everything you can see. Some of you may have noises going on. My laptop is making a noise right now. You may have your temperature. You may have the stuff that you are touching or able to touch. You may have eaten some food and still have the taste of that. You may be having a drink and you've got the taste of that. We are processing hundreds of millions of bits of information at any one time. And we want our student to be focusing on a very specific bit of information, the thing that we are trying to teach them. And that is what we want them paying attention to. Now, when they're paying attention, their working memory is focused on that bit of information. By working memory, we talk about the thing that the brain is focusing on as we are at this moment, the thing that we are thinking of right now. I like to think as like the post-it note that anything you are thinking of at any time can be written down. Now, the brilliance of the working memory, but also its flaw, is it can only hold a certain amount of bits of information at any time. We think between about 4 and 9 bits of information at only one time. Otherwise, the brain struggles to process any more of that. Think about it as a shopping list. If I ask you to go to the shops and buy 2 or 3 things, If I asked you to go to the shops and buy 2 or 3 things, you would probably be able to remember those things. However, if you were going to the shops and I gave you a longer list of 8 or 9 things, you're going to maybe start to forget them. And that's basically because the working memory struggles to remember all those things. So it has a very limited capacity, Now, after we've got something in our working memory, we can either learn it. Now, what I mean by learn is it is processed in our long-term memory. We call learning a change in our long-term memory. Or it isn't processed in the long-term memory and it is forgotten. It moves to forgetting, which means we are not able to retrieve that information again. Or it's in our long-term memory and we can remember it, retrieve that information, recall that information, and we bring it back into our working memory. For example, if I ask you to think about what you had for breakfast, that's probably still there. You can remember that process. But if I ask you what you had for breakfast on the 30th of May 2025, you have probably forgotten that information because you haven't remembered it frequently. We're going to talk about this more as we go on. But the key here is that we can forget things from our working memory, but also from our long-term memory. And we want this cycle going where we are remembering and bringing stuff back to our long-term and working memory constantly. So we're going to talk about the idea of performance versus learning. I'm going to use those 2 terms. Now, what we need to remember is essentially learning takes place inside a student's mind. And because of that, we can't actually observe learning going on. We can't actually observe it going on. Consequently, what we do is we rely on our observations of the student to imply what they have learned. So we get them to do things to show us stuff has been learned because we can't see the actual processes going on in their brain. Now, this is difficult because what we observe is a student performing something. We observe them performing a skill or task. And that is not proof that something has actually been learned. What it is there's a proof they can perform that skill, that content in that moment. Now, so this idea of whether something has been proved to us that has been learned is a really important distinction, especially as us as tutors and the way we work with our students. The problem is the difference between learning and performance is actually quite a subtle idea. So performance and learning are quite big, different ideas, but actually observing the difference between them is quite subtle. So we're going to talk about performance first. Performing is what we are observing the student doing. Arguably, it's all we can ever do. All we can ever do is observe a performance by a student. A couple of quotes here. I'll just give you a moment to read. So, performance is what a student can do, and it's all we can ever observe. We observe them performing. And it's something that we can actually measure. We can measure performance. And it's from, therefore, that this performance is how we infer learning. So we see something being performed and we infer that it has been learned. The problem with both these ideas of performance is that performance is just a short-term impact of something being taught. And I'm going to give an example of this in a moment. And research suggests that actually performance in a moment can actually hinder longer-term learning. Now, performance tends to be something that we can measure and observe during what we would call the acquisition process. We give some students some new content, they perform it back for us, and we infer from that that something has been learnt. And this actually means it's quite a poor indicator for what something has been learnt. Because if we go back to this model, we might just be observing something that is in their working memory. We're not observing a skill that has been brought back from their long-term memory, which is what we actually mean by learning. Learning is a changing long-term memory. Just having something in my working memory does not mean it has been learned. As an example, can you spell the word onomatopoeia? Onomatopoeia. I'll leave it on the screen for now. If you're watching live, this is a little task for you to do live. If you're watching it as a recording, you can give us a go. Right, I would like to try and spell that word. Can you write down and spell the word onomatopoeia? Onomatopoeia. If you're in the live chat and you want to give me a thumbs up in a moment where you've got it right or not, that'd be great. And there's the word onomatopoeia. Yeah, we've got some correct, nearly some correct spellings. It's a really hard word to spell. So if you've spelled, oh, good, we got some correct spellings that some people send me. Got it right, got it right, got it right. Excellent. So I gave you the word and then I asked you to spell it. Now, purely from my side there, can I confidently say that you have spelt that word? Or would I say that you can spell that word? There's a subtle difference here. Am I saying you can now spell that word, i.e. you have learned that? Or am I just saying you spelt that word and you performed it? Now, the problem here is it's literally a word I just gave you. And the recency of that learning is really high. So your retrieval strength is very high because you literally saw the word and then I got you to spell it. And that's because that was a performative skill. I gave you a word, I asked you to spell it almost instantly. Now, I cannot from that infer whether you can spell the word or whether you merely performed the spelling of that word. And this leads us on to a discussion about learning, which is something as tutors, obviously, we really want to prioritize. The problem with performance, what we just talked about, is it feels really good in the moment. Our students go, oh, I can do this. I saw something, I did it, which is great. We want that positivity. Negativity is when we infer, both us and the student, that that has now been learnt, rather than it just being performed. And what we need to think about here is that this short-term performance that we've just discussed is what we call a poor proxy for long-term learning. It's not a good indicator that something has been learnt full-time. For example, if you're think about it this way, if you're learning a new skill, in this case, driving a car, learning to drive is not a singular action, is it? It's not a single thing. You start your lesson with learning knowledge. The teacher or your parent or whoever says this pedal leads to this outcome. If you push this, you accelerate. If you push this, you brake. We then process from this knowledge to learning some skills. Maybe you drive down a road, you drive around a roundabout. And over time, we build an increasingly complex experience of different situations. We drive in different conditions, night, day, rain, sunny. We drive in different cars, fast, slow, automatic, left-hand drive, right-hand drive, four-wheel drive. We follow different rules. We maybe go abroad and we drive on the other side of the road, or we go to a different driving culture and we experience new experiences on the road. And we connect all these ideas to our previously learnt skills. And what you find if you've been driving for a while is that you're no longer refocused on individual skills. I'm not thinking I need to press the brake, I need to press the pedal. I'm just driving the car. Now, at some point in this learning process, I just perform the skill to my driving instructor or in a test. The example I always give here is reversing around a corner. When I was learning to drive, you had to be able to reverse around a corner. It was something we practiced and then I could do. Could I still do that skill as perfectly as I did it? Probably not. Think about a 3-point turn. We've all seen someone on the road mess up a three-point turn, although at some point they would have been able to perform that skill. So driving is a really nice example of where we have skills that we perform, and then we have the longer term thing that we have actually learnt, the skills that we are taking forward. And that's because learning is a change in our long-term memory. If that long-term memory does not change, think back to the model I showed you. If there's no change in that long-term memory, then we would say that is just performance. Something has just been performed. Nothing has actually been learned longer term. So we need to be wary of this dynamic. We need to be very clear to ourselves, is something performing or is it learning? We need to be aware of that as tutors. And again, the problem is here is that short-term performance is a poor indicator of long-term learning. And that's a problem for us as tutors because, and as educators, we're so often based on performance. We spoke about this. We ask our students to perform a skill. So we ask them to perform a skill and we try and infer from that the longer term learning. But the problem is that short-term performance that we're getting them to do is not a great indicator. So the only way we can observe learning is actually something that promotes performance, is what we were trying to stay away from. And that's a really, really annoying dynamic. And we're going to talk about this in more detail going forward. Does anyone have any questions at that point? I've just paused there. You can either write a question down if you're watching this as a recording, or you can put your questions to me, either in the group chat or just individually. Is absolutely fine. There's a couple people typing, so that's fine. So someone's asked about homework. Homework is a really nice example of, absolutely, Gladys, of why sometimes we do this. We give homework for the student to practice this skill again. And then they come back to us and hopefully we've gone into more detail. I'm going to come on to this in more detail in the next section about why we do this. But absolutely, it's one of the reasons we use homework. Someone's asked about this idea of change in long-term memory. How do we observe that? We're going to talk about this in more detail, but one of the ways you can do it is by seeing the same knowledge applied in different scenarios. We call it more flexible. So if you're only ever driving a car scenario, if you only ever drive the same car repeatedly, if I put you in a new car in a new scenario and you can still drive it, then I can be confident that those skills have been learned because you're able to apply it to a different scenario, which is classically what tests are doing a lot with our students. Can they apply their knowledge to a slightly different scenario? So what does all this mean for our tutoring? And this links to what a couple of people said. I want to show you this curve here. It's a very famous curve. So this curve is from a study from 1885. So 140 years old. And yes, I'm still referencing it. It's a really famous study by Ebbinghaus. This is called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Quite a seminal study. And actually, a lot of this, almost all of it, has been shown again and again and again in different scenarios for different people in different scenarios. So it's a study that has been replicated, and therefore the original study is still really strong. And what we've got here is we've got time elapsed. So the change in nature of time and the amount of information that is being retained. And what we can see quite clearly here is as time elapses, less information is retained. That makes complete sense if we think about it. If I got you to watch the news one evening, you would have and ask you immediately what was on the news. You'd be able to tell me a lot. The next day, you might be able to tell me a little less. The next week, you're going to start to struggle. 2 months, 4 years, 10 years time, you're going to really struggle to tell me what was on the news on that day. And what Ebbinghaus did is he did the second part of this study, which gives you this curve, where here we've introduced moments of review. So we're reviewing the initial content. So we've got the original learning. It was being forgotten, and then it was reviewed, which was then learnt, then forgotten, then reviewed, then forgotten, and then reviewed. And what we can see here, and again, this has been backed up again and again, is that when we review content, we remember more of the information, obviously. But you can see here the curves start to change. If I was going all mathsy, I would say the rate of change of these graphs change. If you look at the difference between the first review and the third review, the rate of forgetting is much slower. And that's because we have reviewed the data. Now, you'll see this study in quite a few different ways with percentages and time frames of how perfect this time frame needs to be. So there's a lot of people, you'll see this on the internet a lot, talking about, well, this is 2 months or this is 3 months or stuff like that. Now, the problem is sometimes we get so fixated on specific percentages or timelines that we become like obsessed with using the right ones. And we actually don't know what the optimal amount of time is. We have some ideas, we have some suggestions, but we really don't know. And that's why in my graph here that I'm using, I haven't got time elapsed. I haven't actually got 1 day, 1 week, whatever. And percentages, I haven't got 10 to 100% or anything like that. This is more the idea that if we review things at stages, we get better at remembering. And also note here, the first review was quite close. Then there was a slightly bigger gap, and then we're leaving a bigger gap. And if I continue this, I would have an even bigger gap to the fourth review. I often think about this as like learning a song. If I just listen to a song once and try and sing along, I might be able to sing along to the chorus a bit, but eventually I'm going to quite quickly forget that song. I may remember like the big line of the chorus. Whereas if I repeatedly listen to that song, even if I start to listen to it less frequently, I remember a lot more of the lyrics. I just wanted to take a moment to think about a song from your childhood. Maybe when you were really getting into music, like 14, 15, whatever. And how many lyrics you remember to that. For me, Linkin Park, in the end, I remember pretty much every lyric. Now, I don't listen to that song frequently at all. I can't remember the last time I listened to it. But if you put it on, or if you ask me to sing it, I know every single word. And that's because I've reviewed it so often that it's become information that I have retained. There's been a change in my long-term memory. Whereas if something was just performed, that's going to be forgotten. And here's where we need to be aware that using good learning techniques is really hard as an educator. They're really difficult to do. We want our students to get things right, and we want to give them that sense. So we give them moments performing very early on so we can get something right. It's much harder to think about how we're going to do this a month later or in 2 months' time, because that's a really difficult thing to do, especially in our world of tutoring when we're seeing students much less frequent than their class teacher would be. And here's an example of this. So we do something, or we get our students to do something, and it's easy. So they get it right. So we've done something, it was easy, they get it right. We then say, or the student then says, or we're both guilty of this, that they have learned something. So if I said spell the word and, it's easy, they get it right. Oh, I've learned how to spell and. So they just do this again and again and again, and we just repeat this process. So we do stuff that's easy because it feels like we've learned something. Whereas if we do something and it's hard and we get it wrong, we become more likely to take an idea that we haven't learned something this way. And therefore we don't do it again. We stop doing that thing. And we say the idea that we have this good learning, the good learning we have done on the left here. We got something right, therefore that was good learning, or bad learning because it was hard and we got it wrong. And that's kind of a classic idea here. But we could argue that this is bad learning because we're only doing stuff that's easy that we are able to perform. We're not worried about the long-term consequences. So we do stuff that's easy because it feels good, so we keep doing it. Students are really guilty of this. They do ideas that are make them feel good, like highlighting. It makes them feel great, so they highlight all their notes. It feels good. They can look down, look all the work I've done, but it's not actually a really good way of learning. And this is because performance often gives us a false impression that something has been learned. So I'm going to ask you again, at this stage, can you spell onomatopoeia? That was the word I gave you. Try and write it down in your notes. Try and not look at your note before. Can you spell onomatopoeia? And there's the answer. There's the answer. Now, some of you would have got that right. Fantastic. Some of you have got it wrong. But now I've reviewed this. If I did this again, which I'm not going to do, you're much more likely to get it right because we're repeating it at a different time frame. If I now did this in a week's time and then a month's time and then a year's time, you're going to remember how to spell that word. Whereas the first time we did it was purely a performance, was purely a performative structure. Okay, so let's talk about some practical ideas that you can do in your tutoring session. I'll discuss each of them and then we can discuss how they might apply to your subject areas. So we're going to go through about 5 ways in which you can bring this into your idea. One of them is homework for the person who asked it earlier. So revision clocks. I really like revision clocks. It's a really simple task that you can bring and start to your lesson. So here's what a revision clock looks like. It's just a plain kind of structure. You can get a lot of these online. And what I do is I write my topic title in the middle, and then I try and get my student to remember 12 separate bits about this. And they create a nice revision clock. Here's one from Kate Jones about the book Crime and Punishment, where it's been split up there. That's a really easy thing to bring to your session. But what it helps the student do is break down this big topic into 12 different sections, but they are having to remember stuff. So if I did this at the start of the lesson about the last text we were doing in class, and I got them to write down 12 key ideas. And then from those 12 key ideas, I got them to bring out more information. This revision clock might be something we build over a period of time, but I'm getting them to remember information. And this takes away the performative side of it and promotes them show me that there's been a change in their long-term memory, which is really useful for me. So that's a revision clock. You can get that if you just type in revision clock, you'll get a structure like that. It's a fairly easy one to use. But what it is, it's just a way of breaking down these big bits of information for us. Now we can help our students with this. We could put the titles of the 12 sections. So I could say, in my subject, I might put circle theorems in the middle. I might put 12 things I really need them to know about circle theorems and get the student to write in detail each of those areas. Over time, I might get the student to break it down into 12 areas. But it's just a way for me checking that stuff has been learned previously rather than just purely remembered in the moment, performed. Another, has anyone got any questions about that? Sorry, has anyone got any questions about that? Someone was typing. So when would I use this in a lesson? Someone's asked. I would tend to use these at the start of the lesson. So I just plonk these down, whether it's online, when I'm working with my students with Tutorful, and I get my students, as I said, circle theorems, break down things, or algebra, here's 12 ideas I want them to know. Obviously, you can split up into quarters. If you wanted your clock, you could just have it in quarters. The clock is kind of just a part of kind of them being able to see kind of the procedure of this. I could have a cycle in science where I want them to know 12 stages of something that's going on. I write down the 12 stages and they have to fill in more detail here. It could be past tense verbs in an MFL lesson where I put each of the language there and they have to explain what that word means and maybe use it in a sentence. The next one is tell them the story. So in a previous webinar or another one that you can look up, we talked about meaningfulness, about how we make something meaningful to our student. Now, one way we can help with this is by telling a story. The example I'm going to give is Henry VIII. If I just get my student to tell me facts about Henry VIII, they might just be performing the things we learned early in the lesson. Oh, this is who he was. This is what he did. All really useful bits of information, but it's not really helping me understand whether they've learned something or they're just able to regurgitate these facts. Whereas if I ask them to tell me the story of King Henry VIII or a specific part, maybe for his wives, for example, the student has to take all that information and bring it together and summarize it, make it more concise. And if they're able to do that, that's a much better indication for me that they have learned something rather than just able to perform it in a moment. So that's a really useful idea. I really like telling the story. Now, obviously, it's really useful in history or in English, but I also use this in kind of more practical subjects, more process-based subjects, such as maths and science. So in maths, I might ask the question, can you tell me a story of how you would get the answer here? Rather than just saying, here are the key points, they have to bring it all together, which is a really difficult skill to be able to do and tells me a lot about how that student is doing. So that's a little simple idea. Just tell me the story. Just a change in mindset. Rather than tell me the facts of something, tell me the story. You can do this as a timeline. So you could start the student by creating a timeline that you fill in together, and then you ask them to tell the story of that timeline. They're going to have to use different skills to bring that all together, which is really useful. Has anyone got any questions about tell the story? Yeah, so someone's asked, again, you could use it at any stage of the lesson. I sometimes find this useful to ask at the end of the lesson we have just been doing something on, or at the start of our next lesson. Oh, so just before we start what we would say, can you tell me the story of what we did last session? When I'm getting a student to tell me a story, it's much more likely to emphasize their gaps in the knowledge than if I just ask them to merely list me a load of data. The cognitive process for telling a story is a lot harder and needs learning to be able to do it. This is a strategy retrieval rockets used by Emma Turner, who's a teacher, an educator, an author, a consultant, especially with early years in primary classes. So if you're working with younger students. And it's a really simple idea, either individually when we're working individually with our students, or we could do it in groups, or as a whole class if we're working with big groups. We get the students to recall 5 facts about a topic in order for the rocket to take off. Now, these facts may come in the way of vocabulary, diagrams or pictures, but it helps promote the recall of information. And the rocket here helps them associate the knowledge of retrieval as a key part in the development of the knowledge. So I have to be able to remember stuff. So before we move on, I need you to tell me 5 things about the topic we just did. Right, that means we've got lift off. Let's keep going. Oh, yes, thank you. Someone's just spotted the spelling mistake. You're absolutely right. Thank you. That was me trying to get you to retrieve the knowledge of the spelling of retrieval, which is absolutely not the case. It's just my own flaw there. Thank you very much. Homework. Someone talked about homework here. And this is the idea that homework is more than just a worksheet. A really nice idea that I use is that I use a worksheet that we did in class from last month. So it's not new questions. It's questions they have done before. And often we see this as an educator as a bad thing. I'm giving them questions they have done before. But if I'm able to give them something from a month ago or even earlier, the student is still having to retrieve that information. So if they can still do it, they're much more likely to remember it. If we go back to that curve where we're having those remembering points, I'm helping the student here remembering something longer term. Now, I might have to explain that to the student. Oh, I recognize this sheet. Can't I just copy the answers? No, what we're trying to get you here is seeing if you can recall the information. It also saves you a lot on time because you're not having to make new resources. It also gives you an indicator of what the student could do and what they can still do a month later. And you can use those as kind of reference points. It's a really nice thing to highlight to the student. Oh, look what you could do when we did it in class, and look what you're struggling to now. That will tell me that you've forgotten these key areas, so we need to focus on those. It's a really nice way to say to students, well, we actually need to focus on these areas. So that's one of the reasons we give homework, which was a question used early on. But if we purely talk about this as promoting learning over performance, you can just use a worksheet that you've used previously, or a question or a task. Don't see it as a bad thing that you're using stuff that they have done previously. You don't have to recreate brand new stuff to get those recall moments that we spoke about. And then another one that's a slightly different, slightly harder idea here is to combine topics in our tutoring sessions. So let's say I'm working with a student on Pythagoras. So I'm doing some Pythagoras' theory to do with triangles, And I want to know whether they are just able to perform a task or whether they've got a slightly better understanding of what is going on. So I give them a task like this. Just give you a moment to look through those. Even if you're not a maths teacher, just have a look through. Now, actually, all these questions are about fundamentally the same thing. They all have a Pythagoras element to it. That's the key part of the question. So here, a very clear Pythagoras. Here, I need a bit more knowledge to understand that I'm trying to create a right angled triangle there. I can then find the difference in X and Y and find out the hypotenuse. And here, I need to recognize that to find the area, don't know why it says R area, that should just say area. Find the area of the circle. They need to find out one bit in order to do the next bit. Oh, so that's a really key bit. Sorry. Now, by combining those topics, I'm getting my student to apply the knowledge in different scenarios. If I just give them the one on the left that we've been doing in class, it's very easy for them to perform that. They're just performing that back. Whereas if I get them to do one of the other tasks, or better, I get them to do all the tasks, sorry, someone was just asking me a question there. I'll come back to that in a second. If I get them to perform all these tasks, the knowledge is being applied in a different way, which is a much better indication of something has been learned than is just being performed. Again, we spoke to this idea is all we can really do is observe performance and infer learning from that. But a task like this gives me a better inference that learning has taken place. And you can surely think about how this would work in your subject areas where you're using different ideas and applying them in different situations. So not just can you spell a word, can you use it correctly in a sentence? Could you use it in a different context, maybe in a different tense, for example? Or could you use it in a descriptive piece, a factual piece? That's much more like if I'm just asking you to now spell onomatopoeia, but I ask you to use that in a sentence, well, I can check for your spelling, but also I can check that you've actually processed what that word means, rather than just doing it in the purely same sense each time. Now, this idea of some of the stuff done of performance and learning is quite difficult to incorporate into our tutoring because it sometimes feels like we're going against what's right for the student because we're thinking longer term rather than just can you do something in a moment. And it does sometimes feel like we are just focusing on a specific skill and the short-term performance of them getting something right might actually take a dip. But actually, we want to be coming back to stuff. And it's all about this idea of performance and learning. And just being aware, this is not saying you should never get your students to perform anything. Or you should never get your students to learn anything at all. What this is saying is we just need to be aware of the differences between the two. And not just assume because something has been performed, it has been learnt. And that's the key idea from this webinar today. Just because your student has performed something does not mean it has been learned and will be able to be retained longer term. And that's why we need to build in specific strategies and methods for coming back to these. Now, there's going to be another webinar on what we call distributed learning theory, where I go into this in even more detail about how we can actually do this longer term in our tutoring. Today was just focusing on the key idea and some ideas we can bring into our tutoring. But we need to be aware that we all forget things. And consequently, your students will also forget things. Be aware of that. Don't be scared of that. Don't be worried about it. Just be aware that that's what happens. And therefore, we need to be checking whether our student is just performing or learning. And don't just assume performance means learning. So if you see your student doing something you've done in that session, that is fantastic. Don't hide away from that. But just be aware that that might not mean they are going to be able to do it in a week's time. And we need to help them with that process. It's about understanding the difference between those two words. So just because the student has shown me they can do something now does not mean it has been learnt longer term. So I need to develop ways in my tutoring for them to explain to me or show me that they have learnt stuff longer term. I would just be contemplating. Am I giving my student plenty of opportunities to recall information and apply it to different contexts? Because if I do that, whether it's by telling a story or answering a slightly different question or completing a revision clock, they show me that their learning is more flexible. And we've spoke about that in previous webinars to do with the power of having flexible learning that are not linked to traditional cues. If you're not sure about that, go back and watch the one on meaningfulness. That'd be a really good one to kind of go back to here. So here's where I would consider, am I getting my students opportunities to recall information? If you want some further reading this, I would really recommend this book, Strengthening the Student Toolbox by Amabir Singh Gill, who I've referenced a couple of his quotes today. It's a really good book filled with even more ideas of what you can go to. It's a fantastic book, so I would recommend that. If you want to ask me more questions on this, if you're watching this recording, please come and find me on LinkedIn. You can just ask me a question there. That'd be a great place to come and ask me. You also have some of the other things I do, which top left is Tutoring Tips, the podcast where around 50 tutors have shared a top tip from their tutoring practice, a WhatsApp group where I share ideas about pedagogy and tuition, and also Navigator Tutor, which is my platform. You can go and learn more about it there. But if anyone has any questions about any of this, I'll give you a moment to think about them and write them up. I can see a couple of people are typing, and I'll give a go to answer those questions. Okay, so someone was just asking, do we talk to our students about this? I would be absolutely talking to my students about this. So what I say is fantastic. You've got that right. That is brilliant. We've just done something and you've shown me you can do that. Awesome. Now, what we just need to be aware of, just because you've done it now means you might not be able to do it tomorrow. So I'm going to test you on that when we have our next session. And when I have our next session in a week's time, I might say, like, oh, you know that question you got right last time? I want to see if you can do it again. So I'm quite open with my students about talking about that. What I'm trying to do is make sure they have learned something, not just whether they can perform something. And I might give them an analogy to something that works for them, whether it's to do with playing a musical note on the guitar for the first time, or doing a trick in football, or being able to do something in another subject. Practical subjects are really good for this. Like, just because you were able to hit the crossbar once from the halfway line, does that mean you can always do that? No, you were performing. Also, the word performing means a lot to other students. So we can, if you've got a student who's really good at drama and music, we can talk about that difference between the actual performance of doing something in a moment and the longer term process of learning. So I don't shy away from those words. What I wouldn't do is if a student gets right, it'd be like, oh, it's all well and good getting right, but you probably haven't learned it. It's more from my mindset, just being aware that just because they've done something now doesn't necessarily mean they can do it long term, and just being aware of myself of that. Awesome. So thank you to everyone who has joined this webinar. So I'm going to stay online briefly for those who joined live to answer any questions you may have. But thank you so much for joining. I'll see you next time.